Mafia Boss's fiancée slapped the Black Maid. His response froze the restaurant. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Naomi Brooks. Naomi Brooks had learned to move through expensive rooms the way a shadow moves across polished stone, careful, quiet, and unnoticed, because being unnoticed was how you survived when the plates on the tables cost more than your weekly paycheck and the chandeliers above glowed like distant stars that were never meant for you. That evening, the restaurant was wrapped in low golden light and soft music, the kind that made conversations sound important even when they weren't. And Naomi moved between tables with steady hands, counting steps in her head, 3 to the left, 2 back, the rhythm she used to keep her nerves from showing. She wore the same pressed black uniform she always did, clean, simple, unremarkable, the kind of outfit designed to erase the person inside it. And she was good at that, good at making herself small enough to fit into the spaces other people ignored. At the center of the room sat the couple everyone noticed, Victor Hale and the woman at his side, Madeline Cross. Their table positioned just far enough from the others to command attention without asking for it, the kind of table reserved for people who never waited for anything. Naomi recognized the posture before the faces, the relaxed confidence of people who expected the world to adjust around them, and she adjusted first, aligning the silverware just right, placing glasses exactly where they belonged, her eyes lowered, her voice calm, because calm was safer than anything else. She didn't know then that the room was already holding its breath, that the soft clink of dishes and the muted laughter were about to thin into something brittle, because moments like these never announce themselves. They creep in quietly, dressed like any other night. Naomi reached the table with a practiced smile that didn't ask for approval, only permission to exist, and she offered a brief apology for a delay that hadn't been her fault, a habit formed from years of learning that apologies were cheaper than arguments. Madeline's gaze cut toward her, sharp and assessing, lingering just long enough to measure and dismiss, and Naomi felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the warning her body gave her before words landed harder than they should. Around them, forks paused midair, a few nearby conversations dipped, then tried to recover, and the manager at the bar shifted his weight without moving closer, as if distance could absolve him of what he sensed was coming. Naomi stood still, hands folded lightly, breathing slow, reminding herself of the list taped inside her locker at work. Rent due Friday. Groceries already planned. Bus pass topped up, because survival was a series of small calculations that left no room for pride. The moment stretched, thin and uncomfortable, and then it broke, not with noise, but with a sudden stillness that rippled outward, a silence that spread from the table to the walls and climbed the chandeliers, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the music itself. Naomi's head remained level, her shoulders squared by instinct, because she had learned that the first rule after humiliation was not to give it anything extra, not a tear, not a tremor, not the satisfaction of watching you fold. She focused on the pattern in the carpet beneath her shoes, counted the threads, and waited, because waiting was what she did best. No one noticed the exact second Victor Hale stopped eating. No one noticed the way his hand paused above the table, or how the air around him seemed to change temperature by a degree or two. But the room felt it anyway, the way you feel a storm before the clouds fully gather. And in that charged quiet, before anyone understood what it meant, before anyone dared to speak, the night took its first irreversible turn. The silence did not break all at once. It lingered, stretching thin and uncomfortable, as if the room itself were unsure how to breathe again. And Naomi Brooks stood exactly where she was, hands folded at her waist, eyes steady but unfocused, because she had learned long ago that the safest place to look after public humiliation was nowhere at all. Madeline Cross shifted in her chair with a sharp, irritated movement, the kind of motion that signaled she expected immediate correction, immediate submission, immediate agreement with whatever version of reality she had decided was correct, and her voice followed soon after, smooth and dismissive, loud enough to travel, but soft enough to pretend it was reasonable. She questioned Naomi's competence, her training, her right to be near their table at all, each word wrapped in the tone of someone who had never been told no and had no intention of starting tonight. Naomi listened without reacting, her face calm, her posture straight, her pulse loud in her ears, because reacting would mean giving the moment something it did not deserve. Around them, the restaurant began to move again, but awkwardly, conversations restarting at half volume, laughter delayed and uncertain, diners pretending to be absorbed in menus they had already memorized, the collective instinct to look away fighting with the curiosity to watch. A man 2 tables over adjusted his napkin and stared too long before remembering himself, while a woman near the window leaned closer to her companion and whispered something that made them both glance over, then quickly looked down. The manager, Ethan Miller, hovered near the edge of the dining room with his hands clasped too tightly, his expression caught between apology and fear, calculating which side of the room held more power and choosing stillness instead of action. Naomi felt the familiar weight of that calculation settle on her shoulders, the unspoken understanding that silence from authority often spoke louder than cruelty itself. Madeline continued, her words now edged with impatience, as if Naomi's refusal to shrink visibly were a personal offense, as if dignity were a challenge instead of a boundary, and she gestured toward the table, toward the space Naomi occupied, asserting ownership without ever saying the word. Naomi nodded once, a small acknowledgement meant to end the exchange, and offered to correct whatever was needed, her voice even, respectful, professional, because professionalism was the armor she had been taught to wear when nothing else was allowed. The offer did not satisfy Madeline. It only sharpened her irritation, and the tension thickened again, spreading outward like a ripple in water, quiet but impossible to ignore. Somewhere behind Naomi, a server dropped a fork and the clatter sounded too loud, too sudden, drawing a few nervous chuckles that faded quickly. Naomi could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, not from anger but from the effort of holding herself together, from the memory of other rooms, other faces, other moments where standing still had been the only form of resistance she could afford. She thought of the bus ride home, of the apartment she shared with her mother, of the envelope on the kitchen counter labeled rent, and she reminded herself why she was here, why she stayed calm, why she endured. What she did not see, because no one was watching him closely enough, was Victor Hale's reflection in the polished surface of the table, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the way his gaze shifted from his plate to the space Naomi occupied, and stayed there, measuring not her mistake, but the imbalance unfolding in front of him. The restaurant continued its uneasy performance of normalcy, unaware that the moment had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and Naomi remained standing in the center of it all, quiet, composed, and very much seen by the one person whose attention changed everything. Naomi Brooks had mastered the art of surviving moments like this by turning inward, by letting the noise of the room fade, until all that remained was the steady rhythm of her own breathing and the quiet voice in her head reminding her who she was beyond the uniform. She had learned this skill early, long before polished floors and linen napkins, back when her world was smaller and harsher, when endurance mattered more than fairness. Standing there now, she felt the familiar pull of memory, the way her mind reached backward for balance when the present threatened to tilt too far. She remembered her mother waking before sunrise, tying her hair back with careful hands before long shifts that paid just enough to keep the lights on, teaching Naomi that dignity was not something you waited for permission to have. She remembered the first job where she was told to smile more and speak less, where she learned that calm was often mistaken for weakness by people who had never needed it. Those lessons lived in her posture now, in the way her shoulders stayed level and her chin remained lifted just enough to signal self-respect without inviting further attention. The restaurant around her blurred into shapes and sound, the low hum of voices blending with the soft clink of glasses, but inside Naomi everything was precise and controlled, a quiet inventory of what mattered. She thought of the bus schedule taped inside her locker, of the grocery list folded in her pocket, of the small apartment where her mother waited up late with the television volume low so she could hear the door when Naomi came home. This job paid $13 an hour plus tips on good nights, not enough to feel secure, but enough to feel necessary, and necessity had a way of sharpening resolve. She knew the unspoken rules of rooms like this one, knew how easily a moment could turn into a story told about her instead of by her, and she refused to let that happen. She did not look at Madeline Cross again, not out of fear but out of choice, because giving someone your attention when they sought dominance was a kind of agreement, and Naomi was not agreeing to anything. Instead, she focused on the edge of the table, on the way the candlelight reflected off polished silver, grounding herself in the tangible present. She reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong, that professionalism did not require silence in the face of disrespect, but survival sometimes did, and she chose survival without shame. What Naomi did not know was how closely she was being watched, how every detail of her composure was registering with someone who understood power in a way few people ever did. Victor Hale had seen many forms of fear in his life, loud fear and quiet fear, desperate fear and calculated fear, but what he saw in Naomi was something else entirely, a steadiness born not from confidence, but from necessity, a calm that came from having nothing to lean on except yourself. From his seat, he observed the way she held the moment without collapsing into it, the way she offered professionalism instead of pleading, and something in that restraint caught his attention more sharply than any raised voice could have. He did not interrupt, did not move, did not reveal his thoughts, but his focus narrowed, drawn not to the words being spoken, but to the imbalance beneath them. Around them, the restaurant continued its uneasy attempt at normalcy, unaware that Naomi's quiet endurance was not going unnoticed, unaware that restraint had just been met with recognition, and that recognition, once formed, had a way of changing outcomes far beyond the moment itself. Victor Hale had not planned on becoming the most important presence in the room that night, because men like him rarely needed to announce themselves to be felt, and even seated, even silent, his influence moved ahead of him like a pressure change before a storm. From the outside, he appeared composed, dressed simply but expensively, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested nothing could surprise him anymore. Yet inside, his attention had sharpened to a narrow point, focused entirely on the imbalance unfolding a few feet away. He had built his life on reading rooms, on understanding who held real authority and who merely borrowed it, and what he saw in front of him did not sit well with that understanding. Madeline Cross spoke with the certainty of someone who believed proximity to power was the same as possessing it, and Victor noted the distinction immediately. He had seen this pattern countless times, people mistaking association for entitlement, mistaking volume for control, and he knew exactly how dangerous that confusion could be. He remained still, however, because stillness often revealed more than interruption ever could. He watched Naomi Brooks with a level of focus that surprised even him, taking in the way she did not rush to defend herself, did not perform humiliation for the comfort of others, but instead held her ground with quiet professionalism. There was no appeal in her posture, no expectation of rescue, only self-possession, and that absence of expectation struck him harder than any plea would have. Victor had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him: money, protection, validation, forgiveness, and their wants were always loud, always visible, always transactional. Naomi wanted none of that, and in that refusal, intentional or not, she revealed a strength that could not be bought or threatened. He noticed how the room adjusted unconsciously around her, how the servers slowed their movements, how the nearby tables leaned slightly away as if tension carried weight, and he cataloged those reactions the way he always did, calmly, efficiently. To Victor, power was not about domination but about consequence, about knowing when a moment mattered enough to alter the course of events permanently, and he sensed that this was one of those moments. His relationship with Madeline had always been built on appearances, on shared advantages and mutual convenience, and he had tolerated her sharp edges because they had never been turned outward so publicly, so carelessly. Seeing them now, exposed under the soft lights of a crowded restaurant, he understood something he had ignored for too long, that character revealed itself most clearly when no one expected to be challenged. He did not move to correct her immediately, not because he agreed, but because he wanted to be certain of what he was responding to, and certainty mattered to him more than speed. As Madeline continued to speak, Victor set his fork down with deliberate care, the small sound nearly lost in the room, yet somehow distinct, a subtle signal that something had shifted. He lifted his gaze fully for the first time, no longer observing the situation as an abstraction, but as a decision waiting to be made. His eyes met Naomi's profile briefly, noting the calm line of her jaw, the restraint in her expression, and then returned to Madeline, not with anger, but with a cool assessment that stripped the moment of its theatrics. The restaurant did not know it yet, but Victor Hale had already decided that this was not a situation to be smoothed over or ignored, and once he decided something, outcomes followed, quietly, decisively, and without room for negotiation. Madeline Cross sensed the shift in attention and mistook it for validation, assuming the quiet around her was agreement rather than discomfort, and she leaned into it with the confidence of someone accustomed to being deferred to. Her tone sharpened, not louder but firmer, as if firmness itself were proof of authority, and she directed her remarks toward the table and the space Naomi occupied, framing the situation as an inconvenience that required correction rather than a moment that required reflection. She questioned standards and expectations, implying that excellence was something Naomi should be grateful to be allowed to approximate, and she did so with a practiced ease that suggested this was not new territory for her. Naomi listened, nodding once in acknowledgement, offering to adjust whatever was needed, her words precise and restrained, because escalation had taught her that clarity could be safer than defensiveness. The exchange drew the attention of the room again, not in a sudden wave but in small, incremental glances that gathered weight as they multiplied. A couple at the bar stopped mid-sentence, their glasses hovering inches from the counter, while a group near the back table angled their chairs just enough to watch without appearing to watch. Ethan Miller took a hesitant step forward and then stopped, his face tightening as he recalculated the cost of intervention, the competing risks of upsetting a guest with influence or allowing a situation to continue unchecked. The music continued, low and polished, but it felt out of place now, a soundtrack struggling to keep up with a scene that had grown heavier than it was designed to carry. Naomi felt the pressure of the moment press against her ribs, the instinct to retreat tugging at her, but she held her position, hands steady, shoulders aligned, because she understood that backing away would be interpreted as agreement with a narrative she did not accept. She did not argue, did not apologize again, did not perform humility for the sake of peace, and that restraint unsettled the balance Madeline expected. Frustration flickered across Madeline's expression, brief but telling, and she gestured toward Ethan with a small, impatient motion, signaling for reinforcement rather than resolution. Ethan approached at last, his voice careful, his posture angled toward Madeline as if proximity alone could calm her, and he offered to handle the matter discreetly, to move Naomi to another section, to smooth the edges without addressing the center. Naomi met his eyes and waited, allowing him the space to choose what kind of authority he wanted to exercise, because sometimes waiting was the most revealing test. The room seemed to lean in again, the collective awareness sharpening, and Victor Hale observed it all without comment, his silence growing more conspicuous with each passing second. He watched how Madeline dismissed Ethan's attempt at mediation, how she insisted on control rather than closure, and how Naomi remained composed in the face of pressure that was clearly designed to make her bend. Victor's assessment deepened, layering observation over memory, recalling other rooms where entitlement masqueraded as confidence and where intervention, delayed by convenience, had led to consequences far greater than discomfort. He did not interrupt, not yet, because he wanted the room to see the pattern clearly, to recognize that what was unfolding was not a misunderstanding but a choice being made in real time. As Madeline pressed on, convinced that silence equaled consent, Victor's stillness took on a different quality, no longer passive but deliberate, and those closest to him felt it first, an unspoken signal that something fundamental was about to change. The escalation had reached its limit, not because voices were raised, but because dignity had been tested enough to demand a response, and in that charged quiet, every eye, whether openly or by instinct, began to drift toward Victor Hale, sensing that the next moment would not belong to anyone else. The moment Victor Hale chose to move, it did not announce itself with sound, but with absence, the sudden absence of his stillness, and that alone was enough to draw the room into a tighter focus. He rose from his chair without urgency, smoothing his jacket as if this were any other evening, any other decision, and the subtle scrape of his chair against the floor carried farther than expected, cutting through the low music and scattered murmurs with surgical precision. Conversations faltered, then stopped entirely, and even Madeline Cross paused mid-sentence, sensing that something had shifted beyond her control. Victor did not look at her first, did not address the tension directly, because he understood that power revealed itself most clearly in what it chose to ignore. Instead, he stepped just far enough forward to be seen without invading space, positioning himself so that Naomi Brooks was no longer alone at the center of attention, and in that simple change of alignment, the dynamic of the room altered. Naomi felt it immediately, not as relief but as awareness, the sense that she was no longer bracing against the moment by herself. Victor's gaze settled on her, steady and unhurried, and for the first time since the situation began, the attention placed on Naomi carried no judgment, no expectation, only acknowledgement. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture, did not perform authority for the benefit of those watching, and when he spoke, his tone was calm enough to feel almost gentle, a sharp contrast to the tension it cut through. He asked a single question, directed only to Naomi, simple and direct, asking whether she was all right. The words were ordinary, but in the silence that followed, they carried extraordinary weight, because no one else had thought to ask them. Naomi looked at him then, meeting his eyes fully for the first time, and the room seemed to hold its breath as she considered how to answer. She could feel every gaze pressing in, waiting for her to shrink or to dramatize, but she chose honesty without spectacle, nodding once and replying that she would be fine, that she was simply doing her job. Her voice did not waver, and that steadiness confirmed what Victor had already seen. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, as if her response mattered, because to him, it did. Only then did he turn toward Madeline, and the contrast was immediate, not in volume or anger, but in focus. Where his attention toward Naomi had been open, his attention toward Madeline was precise, measuring, and stripped of indulgence. He did not ask for explanations or offer space for justification, because he did not need them, and the absence of argument unsettled her more than confrontation ever could have. Victor spoke calmly, addressing the behavior he had observed without embellishment, making it clear that public conduct reflected private character, and that character, once revealed, could not be negotiated away. He stated his expectations plainly, not as demands but as boundaries, and in doing so, he removed the illusion that proximity to him granted authority over others. Madeline attempted to interject, her confidence faltering as she realized the room was no longer aligned with her. But Victor did not engage with interruption, maintaining his composure as he concluded what he needed to say. Around them, the restaurant remained frozen, every patron aware that they were witnessing a moment of reckoning not marked by spectacle, but by clarity. Naomi stood quietly beside Victor, not elevated, not patronized, simply respected, and in that respect, the true turn of the evening revealed itself. Power had not raised its voice or demanded submission. It had asked a question, listened to the answer, and chosen dignity as its response. The decision, once spoken, did not arrive with drama but with finality, and Victor Hale's words settled over the room like a clear verdict that required no appeal. He did not announce an ending. He enacted one, calmly and without hesitation, making it unmistakably clear that what had just occurred was incompatible with the standards he lived by and the future he intended to protect. He addressed Madeline Cross with measured composure, explaining that alignment in public reflected alignment in private, and that what he had witnessed revealed a difference in values too large to overlook. There was no accusation in his tone, only certainty, and that certainty carried more weight than anger ever could. Madeline attempted to respond, her voice tightening as she searched for footing that was no longer there, but Victor did not engage in debate, because debate suggested the possibility of compromise, and he was no longer willing to pretend one existed. He stated plainly that their association ended here, not as punishment, but as consequence, and the distinction mattered. The room absorbed the impact in stages, a ripple of awareness moving from table to table as people realized they were witnessing a severing not of convenience, but of credibility. Ethan Miller stood frozen a few steps away, understanding suddenly that the risk he had tried to avoid had passed through him and settled elsewhere, and that neutrality had chosen a side without his consent. Madeline's confidence faltered visibly now, not from embarrassment, but from the sudden absence of protection she had assumed was permanent, and she glanced around the room as if expecting support that did not come. Victor did not linger on her reaction, because his focus was no longer there, and that withdrawal of attention was its own conclusion. He turned instead toward Naomi Brooks, acknowledging her presence again with a brief nod that carried more respect than reassurance, because it recognized her agency rather than rescuing it. He thanked her for her professionalism, not as a performance for the room, but as a genuine acknowledgement of the restraint she had shown under pressure, and in doing so, he reframed the moment entirely. The restaurant remained silent, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the collective understanding that something fundamental had shifted without a single raised voice. Victor signaled to Ethan with a subtle glance, indicating that Naomi would not be moved or reprimanded, and Ethan responded immediately, nodding with a seriousness that suggested he understood the message extended beyond this evening. As Victor reached for his coat, the room seemed to exhale for the first time in several minutes, the tension breaking not into chatter but into reflection, patrons exchanging looks that acknowledged what they had just seen. Madeline stood alone now, her proximity to power dissolved, and for the first time that night, she appeared uncertain, stripped of the assurance that had fueled her earlier confidence. Victor did not escort her out, or demand spectacle, because spectacle would have cheapened the lesson, and instead, he simply prepared to leave, signaling that the evening, and the arrangement it had revealed, were finished. Naomi stepped back into her role with quiet grace, not diminished by what had happened, but steadied by the knowledge that dignity, once recognized, could not be undone. As Victor walked toward the exit, the path before him cleared naturally, not by command but by instinct, and the restaurant watched as justice concluded itself without force, without humiliation, and without the need for anything more than clarity. The room would return to its rhythm soon enough, but the memory of that moment, of power choosing principle over convenience, would linger far longer than the echo of any raised voice. The restaurant did not erupt back into noise right away. Instead, it settled into a subdued rhythm, as if everyone present needed a moment to recalibrate after witnessing a decision that could not be undone. Naomi Brooks returned to her station with deliberate calm, her movements precise, her expression composed, yet inside her chest something unfamiliar loosened, not triumph, not relief, but a quiet sense of being seen without being exposed. Ethan Miller approached her carefully, his voice lower than before, offering a sincere apology for how the situation had unfolded and assuring her that her position was secure, that no report or complaint would touch her record, and that her professionalism had been noted by more than just one person. Naomi listened, nodded, and thanked him, not because she needed reassurance, but because courtesy was part of who she was, even when circumstances tested it. Around them, servers resumed their work with renewed attentiveness. Guests spoke again in hushed tones, and the music regained its place, though softer now, as if unwilling to compete with the memory lingering in the air. At a table near the window, a woman leaned toward her partner and whispered that she had never seen anything like that before, not the confrontation, but the restraint, the way authority had chosen to correct without cruelty. Naomi overheard fragments like that as she passed, not seeking them out, but aware that the narrative had shifted, that she was no longer invisible in the way she had been before. When she brought a fresh glass of water to a nearby table, the man receiving it met her eyes and offered a small, respectful smile, a gesture so ordinary yet so rare that it stayed with her longer than any apology could have. Across the room, Madeline Cross gathered her belongings with rigid efficiency, her movements controlled but brittle, and when she finally left, the door closed behind her without ceremony, marking the end of an association that had seemed untouchable only minutes earlier. Victor Hale did not linger outside the restaurant, but before stepping fully away, he paused near the entrance, glancing back once, not to survey the room, but to ensure that what he had set in motion was holding its shape. His gaze found Naomi again briefly, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement, not as a benefactor, not as a savior, but as someone recognizing another person's integrity. And then he was gone, the quiet certainty of his departure matching the clarity of his decision. Naomi watched the door close, then turned back to her work, feeling taller somehow, not because her circumstances had magically changed, but because the weight she had been carrying alone no longer felt invisible. The rest of her shift passed without incident, yet everything felt subtly different. The room warmer, the conversations less sharp, the sense that respect had been recalibrated rather than demanded. When the night finally wound down and Naomi removed her apron in the staff room, she caught her reflection in the small mirror by the lockers and paused, noticing the steadiness in her own eyes. She thought of her mother waiting at home, of the story she would tell, not as a complaint, but as a reminder that dignity could assert itself even in places designed to overlook it. As she stepped out into the cool night air and headed toward the bus stop, the city lights stretching ahead of her, Naomi understood that justice did not always arrive with noise or applause. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the form of alignment, recognition, and the simple affirmation that standing your ground, even silently, could change the direction of a room, a night, and perhaps something deeper still. By the time the city began to quiet and the restaurant's lights dimmed behind locked doors, the evening had already started to transform into something larger than itself, a story that would be carried quietly by those who witnessed it and reshaped each time it was retold. Naomi Brooks sat on the bus ride home with her hands folded in her lap, the hum of the engine steady beneath her, watching familiar streets pass by through the window, and for the first time in a long while, she did not feel the need to rehearse what she would say if someone asked her how her shift had gone. She thought instead about how quickly the room had changed, not because someone demanded it, but because someone chose to acknowledge what mattered. At home, her mother listened carefully as Naomi described the night, not embellishing, not dramatizing, simply recounting events as they unfolded. And when Naomi finished, her mother reached across the small kitchen table and squeezed her hand, pride softening her tired smile. Somewhere across town, Victor Hale sat alone in a quiet office, reflecting on the decision he had made, not with regret or self-satisfaction, but with the awareness that leadership revealed itself most clearly in moments when no one expected it to. He understood that what he had done would ripple outward in ways he could not fully control, reshaping perceptions, challenging assumptions, and reminding people that power was only as meaningful as the principles guiding it. Madeline Cross would spend the coming days recalibrating her world, explaining an absence she had never imagined needing to justify, learning perhaps for the first time that association without integrity dissolved quickly when exposed to scrutiny. The restaurant would return to its polished routines, its menus and reservations unchanged, yet the staff would move differently now, a subtle confidence woven into their steps, a shared memory of a night when dignity was defended without spectacle. Naomi returned to work the following week and found that small things had shifted, a manager who listened more carefully, patrons who met her eyes, colleagues who stood a little straighter, and while none of these changes were dramatic on their own, together they formed something lasting. She understood then that justice did not always announce itself with applause or confrontation. Sometimes it arrived quietly, leaving behind a recalibrated sense of what was acceptable and what was not. The city continued as it always did, full of noise and imbalance and moments waiting to unfold, but somewhere within it, a line had been drawn, not with anger, but with clarity. Those who had been present would remember the silence more than the words, the stillness, more than the movement, the way a room froze not in fear, but in recognition. And long after the night faded into memory, that recognition remained, a quiet reminder that dignity required no permission, that respect revealed itself in restraint, and that when power chose humility over convenience, the world, if only for a moment, remembered what dignity truly looked like.